The silence in the gymnasium was deafening. Not the kind of quiet that settles over a room naturally, but the stunned, breathless hush that follows something nobody expected to witness. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across the polished, wooden floor, illuminating a scene that would be replayed on phones across the country within hours. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Thompson lay unconscious on the gym floor, his massive frame crumpled like a discarded puppet. His Letterman jacket was twisted around his torso, the golden wuyu for Westfield High barely visible beneath the arm that had gone limp across his chest. A thin line of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, and his face had taken on a grayish pallor that made the scattered students step back instinctively. Standing over him was someone nobody had seen coming. Ethan Parker looked nothing like a fighter. At 16, he was lean rather than muscular, with sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead and wire-rimmed glasses that had somehow stayed on during the confrontation. His school uniform was disheveled, his khaki pants torn at the knee, his white polo shirt stretched and stained with dirt. But it was his posture that commanded attention now. His shoulders were squared, his breathing controlled, and his dark green eyes held a stillness that seemed to silence even the whispered conversations at the edges of the crowd. The remnants of what had been his jacket lay scattered around them like evidence of a crime. Strips of navy blue fabric, cut with surgical precision, told the story of humiliation that had preceded this moment. The sleeves had been severed completely, the back panel sliced into ribbons that now fluttered slightly in the air conditioning. Even his backpack had been targeted. Books and papers spilled across the floor, his calculator cracked, his lunch trampled into an unrecognizable mess. But Marcus wasn't moving, and that changed everything. Behind the growing circle of students, phones emerged like flowers after rain. The familiar glow of recording lights began to dot the gymnasium as everyone realized they were witnessing something that would define Westfield High for years to come. The video quality was shaky at first, nervous hands, rapid breathing. The urgent whispers of teenagers trying to process what they'd just seen. "Did you see that?" Someone whispered, but the question hung unanswered in the air. What they had seen defied explanation. Marcus Thompson was a senior, 6'3", 220 pounds of muscle, earned through 4 years of varsity football and countless hours in the weight room. He was the kind of student who walked through hallways like he owned them, whose presence commanded respect through sheer physical dominance. Teachers stepped aside when he passed. Underclassmen melted into lockers to avoid his attention. Even other athletes gave him a wide berth unless they were part of his inner circle. Ethan Parker, by contrast, had spent most of his high school career trying to be invisible. He was the kid who ate lunch alone while reading textbooks, who chose seats in the back corner of classrooms, who walked with his head down and his shoulders curved inward as if he could fold himself small enough to disappear entirely. Nobody bullied him because nobody noticed him enough to bother. He was background noise, human wallpaper, the kind of student whose name teachers had to check twice on attendance sheets. Yet here he stood, calm and unshaken, while Marcus lay motionless. At his feet, the gymnasium was filled with an electric tension that made the air itself feel charged. Students who had been shooting baskets or running laps had stopped mid-motion, drawn by the gravitational pull of unexpected violence. But this wasn't the chaotic, flailing kind of fight that usually broke out in school hallways. There was something precise about what had happened, something that spoke of training and intention rather than desperate fury. Coach Rodriguez emerged from his office, whistle bouncing against his chest as he jogged toward the commotion. His face wore the practiced expression of a man who had broken up countless teenage altercations, but his stride faltered when he saw Marcus on the ground. His eyes swept from the unconscious football star to the quiet boy standing nearby, then to the shredded remains of what had once been a school jacket. What the hell happened here? His voice carried the authority of 20 years coaching high school sports, but even he seemed unsure how to process the scene before him. Nobody answered immediately. The students who had witnessed it seemed to be questioning their own memories. It had happened so fast, yet with such deliberate precision, that the human mind struggled to categorize it. One moment Marcus had been laughing, scissors glinting in his hand as he made another cut through Ethan's jacket. The next he was airborne, then falling, then still. A junior named Rebecca Martinez stepped forward hesitantly. She had been close enough to see everything, her own workout forgotten as the confrontation unfolded. Marcus was cutting up his clothes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. With scissors, he was laughing about it. Coach Rodriguez's expression darkened. He knelt beside Marcus, checking for a pulse, his fingers pressed against the boy's neck with practiced efficiency. The rhythm was strong and steady, which brought visible relief to his features, but Marcus remained unconscious. And then, "Coach," Rodriguez prompted, though his attention remained focused on the injured student. Rebecca glanced at Ethan, who stood motionless, his hands at his sides. Then Ethan ... I don't know what he did. It was like Marcus just ... went to sleep. The description was inadequate, but it was the best anyone could offer. What they had witnessed was a rear naked choke, executed with the kind of technical precision that comes from years of dedicated training. Ethan had slipped behind Marcus with fluid grace, his arms snaking around the larger boy's neck, applying pressure to the carotid arteries with surgical accuracy. Marcus had struggled for perhaps 15 seconds before his body had gone limp, and Ethan had lowered him to the ground with careful control. But to the untrained eyes of his classmates, it looked like magic. Dark magic that transformed the quiet, forgettable boy into something dangerous and unknowable. The sound of approaching sirens began to filter through the gymnasium's high windows. Someone had called 911, though nobody seemed to remember who. The principal would arrive soon, followed by paramedics, police officers, and eventually parents. The formal machinery of crisis response was already grinding into motion, but for now, there was only this moment of suspended time. Ethan finally moved, but not to flee or explain himself. Instead, he knelt down and began gathering the scattered pieces of his belongings. His movements were methodical, unhurried, as if he were alone in the gymnasium rather than surrounded by dozens of staring classmates. He picked up his broken calculator, closed his torn textbooks, collected the pages that had spilled from his backpack. When he reached for a piece of his destroyed jacket, he paused for just a moment, his fingers tracing the clean edge where the scissors had cut. The fabric was expensive, not designer expensive, but the kind of quality that spoke of careful saving and deliberate choice. His mother had bought it for him at the beginning of the school year, part of their annual back-to-school shopping trip that always stretched their budget thin. She had insisted he needed at least one nice jacket, something that would help him fit in with the other students at Westfield High. He had protested that it was too much money, that a cheaper alternative would be fine, but she had been adamant. "You deserve nice things too, Ethan," she had said, smoothing the jacket across his shoulders in the department store dressing room. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." Now that jacket was ruined, cut into ribbons by someone who had never had to worry about the cost of replacement. The irony wasn't lost on him, though it brought no satisfaction. He folded the pieces carefully and placed them in his backpack, as if they were still worth preserving. The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the school. Students appeared in the gymnasium doorways, craning their necks to see what had happened. The whispered conversations grew louder as the story passed from person to person, each retelling adding new details or embellishments. By the time it reached the students in the parking lot, Ethan had become a ninja who had appeared from nowhere to strike down the school's star athlete. But the reality was both simpler and more complex than any of the emerging rumors suggested. Ethan Parker wasn't a ninja or a secret agent or any of the other dramatic personas that teenage imagination would assign to him. He was a quiet kid who had been pushed too far, who had finally used skills he had hoped never to need in this context. The training that had given him the ability to render Marcus unconscious had been learned not for aggression, but for the opposite reason entirely. 3 years earlier, after a particularly brutal encounter with a group of 8th graders who had cornered him behind the middle school, Ethan had begged his mother to let him learn to defend himself. Not to become a fighter, but to never again feel the helplessness that came with being completely at someone else's mercy. She had researched martial arts schools with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else in their lives, eventually settling on a small Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academy across town. The art had appealed to her precisely because it wasn't about striking or aggression. It was about leverage, technique, and the ability to neutralize threats without causing unnecessary harm. She had watched through the academy's windows as smaller practitioners routinely submitted much larger opponents, using patience and precision rather than brute force. "It's like chess," the instructor had explained during their first visit, "but with your body." Ethan had embraced the training with quiet intensity. While other teenagers were playing video games or hanging out at the mall, he was learning to read body language, to feel the subtle shifts in weight and pressure that telegraphed an opponent's intentions. He learned to be comfortable in positions that would panic most people, pinned under someone much larger, his breathing restricted, his options seemingly limited. In those moments, the art taught him to remain calm, to think clearly, and to find solutions that others couldn't see. But he had never wanted to use those skills like this. The techniques were supposed to be insurance, a safety net that would hopefully never be needed. The goal was always to avoid confrontation, to diffuse situations before they escalated, to walk away whenever possible. Violence was the last resort, to be used only when all other options had been exhausted. Today, those other options had been stripped away systematically. Marcus had made sure of that. Coach Rodriguez stood up slowly, his knees protesting the movement. Marcus was beginning to stir, his eyelids fluttering as consciousness gradually returned. The coach's relief was visible, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this incident would trigger investigations, meetings, and consequences that would ripple through the school for months to come. "Everybody back up," he commanded, his voice carrying the tone that had managed countless locker rooms. "Give him space to breathe." The crowd reluctantly shuffled backward, but nobody left. This was the kind of moment that would be discussed for years, the kind of story that would grow in the telling until it became legend. The quiet kid who had knocked out the football star. The David and Goliath story that played out in real time, captured on dozens of phones from multiple angles. But as Ethan continued to gather his belongings, his expression remained unreadable. There was no triumph in his posture, no satisfaction in his movements. If anything, he looked tired, not physically exhausted, but emotionally drained in the way that comes from crossing a line you never wanted to cross. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The gymnasium doors burst open as Principal Dr. Sarah Chun arrived, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Behind her came the assistant principal and the school nurse, followed by the first of the paramedics. The formal response had begun, and with it came the end of this suspended moment, where anything had seemed possible. As the adults took control of the scene, directing students away from the area and beginning their preliminary assessments, Ethan finally stood up. His backpack was secured, his destroyed jacket carefully stored away, his dignity intact despite everything that had been taken from him. He looked around the gymnasium one last time, his gaze passing over the faces of classmates, who were seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in their lives. Then he walked toward the exit, his stride steady and unhurried. Behind him, Marcus was being helped to his feet by the paramedics, still groggy but conscious enough to realize that something fundamental had changed. The social order that had seemed as permanent as gravity had shifted in ways that nobody fully understood yet. The phones continued recording as Ethan disappeared through the gymnasium doors, already carrying his story to audiences far beyond Westfield High. But he didn't look back to see the impact he was leaving behind. He had somewhere else to be, someone else he needed to protect, and a long conversation with his mother that couldn't be delayed any longer. The quiet kid had found his voice, but the sound it made wasn't what anyone had expected. 6 hours earlier, the alarm clock in Ethan Parker's bedroom buzzed at exactly 5:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. The sound was soft but insistent, designed not to wake his mother, who worked double shifts at Mercy General Hospital and desperately needed every minute of sleep she could get. Ethan's hand moved automatically to silence it, muscle memory guiding him through the darkness of the small apartment they shared in the Riverside district of the city. The apartment was clean but worn, the kind of place where every piece of furniture told a story of careful budgeting and practical decisions. The coffee table had been rescued from a garage sale and refinished by hand. The couch bore the gentle impressions of years of use, but was covered by a throw blanket that Ethan's grandmother had crocheted before she passed. Family photos lined the mantel above a fireplace that hadn't worked in years, showing better times when his father had still been part of their lives. Ethan moved through his morning routine with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned early not to waste time or resources. He showered quickly, using the generic shampoo they bought in bulk from the discount store. His clothes were laid out from the night before, khaki pants that he'd grown into rather than out of, a white polo shirt that his mother ironed every few days in batches, and the navy blue jacket that would in a few hours be destroyed by a pair of school scissors out in the kitchen. He prepared 2 lunches simultaneously. His own consisted of a peanut butter sandwich, an apple that was slightly past its prime but still edible, and a bottle of water he'd refill from the fountain at school. His mother's lunch was more substantial: leftover pasta from dinner, a small salad, and the good granola bars they splurged on because she needed the energy for her 12-hour shifts. He packed both meals into reused containers, writing her name on her bag with a reminder to eat something during her break. Linda Parker emerged from her bedroom at 5:50, already dressed in her scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in the practical ponytail that would survive the rigors of her workday. At 38, she looked older than her years, the stress of single parenthood and financial pressure having carved lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. But her smile was genuine. When she saw Ethan setting her coffee cup on the counter, prepared exactly the way she liked it. "You don't have to take care of me, baby," she said, the same gentle protest she made every morning. "I know," Ethan replied, the same response he gave every time, "but I want to." They shared breakfast in comfortable silence, both reading. She reviewed her patient notes from the previous shift while he completed the calculus homework he'd started the night before. This was their time together. These 20 minutes before the day pulled them in different directions. No television, no distractions, just the quiet presence of 2 people who had learned to depend on each other completely. Linda worked at the hospital's emergency department, where she saw humanity at its worst and best on a daily basis. The pay was decent but not exceptional, and the single-parent household meant that luxuries were rare and carefully considered. Ethan's jacket had been one of those considerations, debated for weeks before she decided that her son deserved at least one nice thing that would help him fit in at his new school. Westfield High was supposed to be a fresh start. They'd moved districts specifically so Ethan could attend a school with better academic programs and more opportunities for college preparation. The commute was longer and more expensive, requiring 2 bus transfers and careful timing, but Linda believed education was the path out of their circumstances. She'd grown up in neighborhoods where college wasn't expected or encouraged. Where teenage pregnancy and dead-end jobs were more common than graduation ceremonies, Ethan would be different. He had to be. The move had been prompted by an incident at his previous school that neither of them liked to discuss in detail. A group of older students had cornered Ethan after classes, demanding money they believed he had because of some perceived slight or social miscalculation that teenagers could turn into warfare. When he'd tried to explain that his family couldn't afford to pay what they considered protection money, the situation had escalated quickly. The physical damage had been minimal, some bruises, a split lip, clothes torn but repairable. Psychological impact had been more severe. For weeks afterward, Ethan had jumped at unexpected sounds, had trouble sleeping, and developed an almost pathological need to know where every exit was located in any room he entered. Linda had watched her confident, curious son withdraw into himself, becoming smaller and quieter until she'd realized that staying in their neighborhood would slowly destroy everything she'd worked to build for their family. The decision to move had meant giving up the apartment where they'd lived since Ethan was in elementary school, leaving behind the neighbors who had become surrogate family, and stretching their already tight budget even thinner. But it also meant hope. Westfield High had a reputation for academic excellence and college preparation. The student body was more diverse, both economically and racially, which Linda hoped would mean fewer assumptions about who belonged and who didn't. What she hadn't anticipated was how the school's social hierarchies would affect her son. Westfield might have been more academically rigorous, but it was still a high school, complete with all the cruelties and casual violence that teenagers could inflict on each other. The Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Academy had been Ethan's idea, born from the recognition that his previous strategy of avoiding confrontation completely wasn't sustainable. He'd researched options methodically, reading articles about different martial arts, watching videos online, and eventually visiting several schools to observe classes. Most had felt aggressive to him, focused on striking and dominance in ways that made him uncomfortable. Gracie Academy was different. Located in a converted warehouse in the industrial district, it was owned and operated by Professor Miguel Santos, a soft-spoken Brazilian immigrant who had competed professionally for over a decade before retiring to teach. The atmosphere was serious but not hostile, focused on technique rather than intimidation. Jiu-Jitsu is not about fighting, Professor Santos had explained during Ethan's first visit. It's about problem solving. Every position is a puzzle to be solved. Every opponent presents different challenges that require different solutions. The goal is not to hurt people, it's to control them, to give them the opportunity to make better choices. The philosophy had resonated with both Ethan and his mother. This wasn't about becoming aggressive or seeking out conflict. It was about developing the confidence that came from knowing you could protect yourself if necessary. The calm that came from understanding that even in seemingly hopeless situations, there were always options if you remained patient and thought clearly. Ethan had thrown himself into the training with characteristic intensity. While his classmates were discovering parties and dating and all the typical diversions of teenage life, he was learning to read micro-expressions, to feel the subtle weight shifts that telegraphed an opponent's intentions. To remain calm under pressure that would panic most people. The training was expensive, more than their budget could comfortably accommodate. But Linda had recognized it as an investment in her son's confidence and safety. She picked up extra shifts when possible, cut corners in other areas, and told herself that the temporary financial strain was worth it if it meant Ethan could walk through the world without fear. Professor Santos had quickly recognized Ethan's natural aptitude for the art. The boy was patient where others were hasty, technical where others relied on strength, and possessed an unusual ability to remain calm in high-stress situations. But, more importantly, he understood the defensive nature of the art, using techniques to control and neutralize rather than to dominate or humiliate. He has the mind of a true martial artist, Professor Santos had told Linda after Ethan's first few months of training. He studies not to hurt others, but to protect himself and those who cannot protect themselves. This is the real purpose of martial arts. At school, however, Ethan remained largely invisible. He'd learned early that the safest strategy was to avoid drawing attention to himself, to move through the hallways like background music, present but unnoticed. He chose seats in the back corners of classrooms, ate lunch alone while reading, and declined invitations to social events that might put him in situations where conflict could arise. His academic performance was excellent but not flashy. He turned in assignments on time, answered questions when called upon, and maintained grades that would qualify him for scholarship opportunities without making him a target for resentment. Teachers appreciated his quiet competence but rarely remembered him after the semester ended. To most of his classmates, he was simply part of the scenery, as forgettable as the motivational posters on the classroom walls. This invisibility had served him well for most of his time at Westfield High. He'd managed to avoid the social dramas that consumed other students, the territorial disputes over lockers and lunch tables, the complex hierarchies that determined who was popular and who was outcast. But invisibility was a fragile protection that depended on the goodwill of those who had the power to make others visible against their will. Marcus Thompson had that power. As the star quarterback of a football team that had won 2 consecutive state championships, he moved through Westfield High like royalty. Teachers deferred to him, administrators celebrated his achievements, and fellow students competed for his approval. His academic performance was mediocre at best, but nobody questioned his right to occupy space in advanced placement classes where his presence seemed to be considered more important than his comprehension. Marcus surrounded himself with a carefully chosen group of followers who served various functions in his personal ecosystem. There was Derek Miller, whose family owned the largest construction company in the county, and who could be counted on to host parties when his parents were out of town. Tyler Walsh was the team's starting linebacker, 6'4" and built like a refrigerator, useful for intimidating anyone who might challenge Marcus's authority. Kevin Foster rounded out the group, a tennis player whose main qualification seemed to be his ability to laugh at Marcus's jokes on cue and provide validation for whatever the quarterback wanted to do. Together, they formed a kind of mobile ecosystem of privilege that moved through the school with impunity. They occupied the best tables in the cafeteria, monopolized the most convenient parking spots, and seemed exempt from the rules that governed other students. When they were loud in the library, librarians asked other students to be quieter. When they pushed ahead in lunch lines, everyone pretended not to notice. When they made inappropriate comments to female students, teachers suddenly found reasons to look the other way. The system worked because everyone understood their role within it. Students who cooperated with the social order were protected by their compliance. Those who challenged it faced consequences that ranged from social ostracism to more direct forms of intimidation. The adults who supervised the school maintained plausible deniability by focusing on academic achievements and ignoring the social dynamics that actually governed students' daily experiences. For most of his junior year, Ethan had successfully navigated this environment by remaining beneath notice. He'd learned to time his movements through the hallways to avoid crossing paths with Marcus and his group. He'd chosen his classes carefully, avoiding electives where social interaction was required. He'd even mapped out alternative routes between classrooms that minimized his exposure to potential conflicts, but invisibility required constant vigilance, and it only took one moment of inattention for everything to change. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan had been walking to his locker after the last period when he'd witnessed something that shattered his carefully maintained neutrality. A freshman named David Kim had been backed against a wall by Tyler Walsh, who was demanding to see the contents of the smaller boy's backpack. David was new to the school, having moved from California with his family when his father's job had relocated. He was small for his age, serious about his studies, and spoke with a slight accent that made him stand out in ways that could be dangerous for a teenager. "I heard your family has money," Tyler had been saying, his massive frame blocking David's. "Escape route. Nice car, nice clothes. You can spare some lunch money for the team fund." It wasn't actually a team fund, of course. It was simply extortion dressed up in language that provided plausible deniability if any adults asked questions. David had tried to explain that he didn't carry cash, that his parents paid for his lunch through an electronic account, but Tyler wasn't interested in explanations. Ethan had watched from 30 feet away, recognizing the fear in David's eyes. The way the younger boy's shoulders hunched as he tried to make himself smaller. It was a mirror of his own experience from years earlier, the same helplessness he'd felt when cornered by students who viewed his existence as somehow offensive to their sense of natural order. The smart thing would have been to keep walking, to maintain his invisibility and avoid drawing attention to himself. David's problems weren't his responsibility, and intervening would only make him a target. But something in the younger boy's expression, a resignation that spoke of other schools, other hallways, other times when no one had stepped forward to help, had made it impossible for Ethan to simply walk away. "Hey, Tyler," he'd called out, his voice carrying just enough authority to make the larger boy turn around. "Coach Rodriguez is looking for you." Something about a film review for Friday's game. It was a lie, but a plausible one. Tyler had hesitated, clearly annoyed at the interruption, but unwilling to ignore a summons from the football coach. The moment of uncertainty had been enough for David to slip away, disappearing into the crowd of students heading for the exits. Tyler had realized he'd been manipulated, but by then it was too late to pursue the matter without looking foolish. Instead, he'd focused his attention on Ethan, studying him with the kind of predatory assessment that marked the beginning of a very different kind of relationship. "I know you," Tyler had said, though they'd never actually spoken before. "Parker, right? Quiet kid from the East Side." Ethan had nodded, keeping his expression neutral while calculating the distance to the nearest exit and the likelihood that he could reach it before Tyler decided to escalate the situation. "You just made a big mistake," Tyler had continued. "Nobody interferes with team business. Nobody." Then he'd walked away, leaving Ethan with the sinking realization that his carefully maintained invisibility had been shattered by a single moment of conscience. He'd protected David Kim, but in doing so, he'd painted a target on his own back that would only grow larger with time. That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, he'd felt the shift in how Marcus's group looked at him when their paths crossed. In the hallways, the casual indifference had been replaced by something more focused, more intentional. They were studying him, learning his patterns, waiting for the right moment to demonstrate what happened to students who forgot their place in Westfield High's social ecosystem. Ethan had tried to return to his previous invisibility, varying his routes through the school, eating lunch in different locations, staying alert for signs that the situation was escalating. But he'd also continued his training at Gracie Academy with renewed intensity, practicing scenarios that he hoped he'd never need to use, but that his instincts told him were becoming increasingly likely. Professor Santos had noticed the change in his students' training, the way Ethan had begun asking questions about self-defense applications rather than just sport techniques. The older man had been careful not to pry, but he'd made sure to emphasize the principles that separated martial arts from simple violence. "The strongest person is not the one who can hurt others," he'd reminded Ethan during one particularly intense session. "The strongest person is the one who can protect without becoming what he fights against." Now sitting at the breakfast table with his mother, watching her prepare for another day of caring for people in crisis, Ethan wondered if he'd be able to live up to that standard when the moment finally came. Because despite all his efforts to avoid confrontation, He could feel the pressure building around him like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The next few hours would determine whether 3 years of training had prepared him for something no amount of practice could truly simulate. The moment when invisibility was no longer an option, and the only choices left were to stand and fight or to surrender everything he'd worked to protect. The first sign that Tuesday would be different came during second period chemistry. Ethan had chosen his usual seat in the back row, next to the windows where he could watch the parking lot and the maintenance workers tending to the landscaping. It was a position that gave him clear sight lines to both the classroom door and the emergency exit. Habits formed from months of calculating escape routes and potential threats. Mrs. Patricia Hoffman was explaining molecular bonding structures when the classroom door opened without a knock. Derek Miller walked in, his expensive sneakers squeaking slightly against the linoleum floor. He wore the casual confidence of someone who had never been told he couldn't interrupt a class whenever he felt like it. "Sorry, Mrs. H," Derek said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Principal Chun needs to see Ethan Parker in her office. Something about a scheduling conflict." Mrs. Hoffman paused mid-sentence, clearly annoyed by the interruption, but unwilling to challenge a student whose father donated generously to the school's athletic programs. She glanced at Ethan, who had gone very still in his seat. "Take your things," she said quietly. "We'll catch you up tomorrow." Ethan packed his textbook and notebook with deliberate slowness, his mind racing through possibilities. He'd never been called to the principal's office before, had never given anyone reason to summon him for disciplinary action. The timing felt wrong, too convenient, especially with Derek Miller serving as the messenger. As they walked through the empty hallways, Derek maintained a casual pace, occasionally nodding to friends who passed between classes. To any observer, they might have looked like two students simply moving from one appointment to another. But Ethan noticed the subtle details that suggested otherwise. The way Derek positioned himself between Ethan and the side corridors, the route they were taking that avoided the main administrative office, the slight smile that played at the corners of Derek's mouth. "You know," Derek said conversationally as they turned down a hallway that led toward the gymnasium rather than the principal's office, "Marcus has been asking about you lately, curious about your background, your family situation. He likes to know who he's dealing with." They passed the trophy case that dominated the main corridor, filled with evidence of Westfield High's athletic achievements. Marcus's photograph appeared in several team photos, his presence commanding attention even in still images. State championship trophies gleamed under the fluorescent lights, each one representing thousands of hours of training and the dedicated support of a community that valued winning above almost everything else. "Interesting family history you have," Derek continued. "Single mom, works at the hospital. Had to move districts because of some trouble at your old school. That must have been embarrassing." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Derek's information was accurate but incomplete, suggesting that Marcus's group had done their research but hadn't uncovered the full story. They knew about the surface details of his life, but not about the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training that had consumed his afternoons for the past 3 years. They reached a corridor that Ethan recognized as leading to the older section of the building, where unused classrooms and storage areas created blind spots in the school's security coverage. The cameras here were older, their coverage sporadic, and the foot traffic was minimal during class periods. "This isn't the way to the principal's office," Ethan said. Stopping in the middle of the hallway, Derek turned around, his friendly mask slipping just enough to reveal something harder underneath. "Smart kid. Marcus said you were observant." He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text. "Change of plans. The principal thing was just to get you out of class without making a scene." Within moments, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from both directions. Tyler Walsh emerged from a side corridor, his massive frame filling the narrow space. Behind Ethan, Kevin Foster appeared, cutting off any retreat toward the main building. Marcus Thompson came last, walking with the unhurried confidence of someone who had orchestrated countless similar encounters. "Ethan Parker," Marcus said, his voice carrying the tone of a host welcoming a guest to his home. "Finally, we get a chance to talk privately." The hallway felt smaller with all four of them present, their collective presence creating a pressure that seemed to compress the air itself. Ethan found himself calculating distances and angles, his training automatically, assessing threats and potential responses. But he also recognized that any physical confrontation here would be 4 against 1, in a location where no help would arrive in time to matter. 3 weeks ago, Marcus continued, circling slowly around Ethan like a predator studying prey. "You interfered with team business." Tyler was having a conversation with a new student, helping him understand how things work around here. "You decided to play the hero." Ethan remained silent, knowing that anything he said would be used to justify whatever they had planned. He focused on his breathing, on staying calm, on being ready for whatever came next. "See, that created a problem for us," Marcus went on. "Because if word gets around that anyone can just interrupt our business without consequences, then the whole system breaks down. People start thinking they can disrespect us and ignore the natural order of things." Tyler cracked his knuckles, a sound that echoed off the cinder block walls like small explosions. "We tried to handle this quietly," he rumbled. "Gave you time to apologize, to make things right, but you've been avoiding us. Like a little mouse," Kevin added with a laugh. "Scurrying through different hallways, eating lunch in weird places. Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" Derek pulled something from his backpack, a small digital camera, the kind used for recording school projects and student activities. "Don't worry," he said, checking the settings. "This is just for our records, evidence that we tried to resolve this peacefully." The camera's red recording light began blinking, and Ethan realized that whatever happened next would be documented, probably edited to show only the parts that supported their version of events. They weren't just planning to intimidate him. They were planning to humiliate him in a way that could be shared, replayed, and used to reinforce their dominance for months to come. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when calling plays during football games. "You're going to apologize for interfering with Tyler's conversation. You're going to admit that you don't belong at this school, that your family can't afford to be here, and that you'll mind your own business from now on." He stepped closer, close enough that Ethan could smell his expensive cologne and see the small scar above his left eyebrow from a football injury that had made local news the previous season. "And then," Marcus continued, "you're going to call your mommy at work and tell her to come pick you up because you're too sick to finish the school day. Because after this conversation, I think you're going to need some time to recover." The threat was clear without being explicitly stated. They wanted submission, public humiliation, and the kind of psychological damage that would ensure Ethan never again considered challenging their authority. The camera would capture his surrender, creating lasting evidence of what happened to students who forgot their place in Westfield High's social hierarchy. "I'm not doing that," Ethan said quietly. The words seemed to surprise even him, emerging with a calm certainty that cut through the tension like a blade. Marcus blinked, clearly not expecting resistance at this stage of the encounter. In his experience, students surrounded and outnumbered always chose the path of least immediate harm, accepting whatever consequences he deemed appropriate in exchange for ending the confrontation as quickly as possible. "Excuse me?" Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I said I'm not doing that," Ethan repeated, his voice gaining strength. "I'm not apologizing for helping someone who was being threatened. I'm not admitting to things that aren't true. And I'm not calling my mother at work to pick me up like a sick child." The silence that followed was electric, charged with disbelief and growing anger. Tyler shifted his weight, moving closer to cut off Ethan's escape route toward the main building. Kevin positioned himself near the side corridor, blocking that exit as well. Dara continued recording, the camera's red light blinking steadily as it captured what would become either Ethan's humiliation or something else entirely. "You really don't understand how this works, do you?" Marcus said, his friendly tone now completely abandoned. "This isn't a negotiation. This isn't a debate. This is us telling you how things are going to be, and you accepting reality." He gestured to Tyler, who stepped forward with the slow deliberation of someone who had done this many times before. The linebacker's hands were massive, easily capable of lifting Ethan off the ground or pinning him against the wall while the others did whatever they had planned. But as Tyler reached for him, something unexpected happened. Instead of cowering or trying to run, Ethan stepped into the contact, his movement fluid and controlled. His hands came up not in a defensive gesture, but in the grip position he'd practiced thousands of times at Gracie Academy. For just a moment, Tyler found himself in an awkward position, leaning forward with his weight committed, his balance compromised by Ethan's unexpected movement. It was an opening that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in the minds of everyone watching. "Interesting," Marcus said, studying Ethan with new attention. "Where did you learn to move like that?" Before Ethan could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the confrontation. Mrs. Rodriguez, the Spanish teacher, appeared at the end of the hallway, carrying a stack of papers and looking harried from her preparation period activities. "Boys," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had managed teenagers for over 2 decades. "Shouldn't you be in class right now?" The group dispersed with practiced efficiency, each member moving in a different direction, as if they had simply encountered each other by chance in the hallway. Derek pocketed his camera, Tyler headed toward the gymnasium, and Kevin melted into a side corridor. Only Marcus remained, taking a moment to straighten his Letterman jacket and fix Ethan with a stare that promised this conversation was far from over. "This was just the warm-up," he said quietly, speaking low enough that Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't hear from her position down the hall. "After school, gymnasium, we will finish this properly." Then he walked away, leaving Ethan alone with the teacher who had unknowingly interrupted what could have been a much more serious confrontation. "Are you all right, honey?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, her maternal instincts picking up on the tension that still hung in the air like smoke. "I'm fine," Ethan replied, though his hands were trembling slightly from the adrenaline that had flooded his system. "Just heading back to class." But as he walked toward the main building, he knew that the relative safety of the classroom was only temporary. Marcus had made his intentions clear. This would be settled after school, in the gymnasium where there would be no teachers to interrupt, no witnesses except for those who were part of Marcus's inner circle. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of growing tension. During lunch, Ethan noticed Derek sitting at a table near the cafeteria entrance, positioned where he could observe who came and went. In the hallway between classes, Tyler appeared with suspicious frequency, always managing to be present when Ethan moved from room to room. Kevin made a point of walking past Ethan's locker multiple times, his presence a constant reminder that he was being watched. The psychological pressure was carefully orchestrated, designed to wear down his resistance and fill his mind with anxiety about the confrontation that was coming. It was a tactic that had probably worked countless times before, breaking down students' confidence until they were willing to accept whatever terms Marcus offered in exchange for ending the psychological torture. But the training at Gracie Academy had prepared Ethan for exactly this kind of mental warfare. Professor Santos had taught him that the mind was the first battlefield in any conflict, that controlling your thoughts and emotions was more important than any physical technique. "Fear is information," the professor had often said. "It tells you that something requires your attention, but it should not control your decisions." Feel the fear, acknowledge it, but do not let it choose your actions. During his final class of the day, Advanced Placement Literature, Ethan found himself reading a passage from The Old Man and the Sea that seemed particularly relevant to his situation. Hemingway's description of the old fisherman's determination, in the face of overwhelming odds, resonated with something deep in his chest. "A man can be destroyed but not defeated," he read silently, the words taking on new meaning in the context of his current circumstances. Ms. Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Tyler despite the shared surname, was discussing the themes of perseverance and dignity in the face of adversity when the final bell rang. Students began gathering their belongings with the usual end-of-day energy, but Ethan remained in his seat, knowing that walking out that door would begin the final act of a drama that had been building for weeks. Through the classroom windows, he could see the gymnasium in the distance, its brick walls and high windows looking more like a fortress than a place of education and athletic training. Somewhere inside that building, Marcus and his crew were waiting, probably setting up cameras to record whatever they had planned, arranging the space to ensure maximum humiliation with minimum chance of interruption. Ethan packed his backpack, slowly making sure everything was secure. His textbooks, his notebooks, the remains of his lunch that he'd been too nervous to finish, and wrapped carefully in tissue paper at the bottom of the bag, the hand wraps that he used for training at Gracie Academy. He hadn't planned to need them today, but as he felt their familiar weight against his back, he realized that all of his preparation had been leading to this moment. 3 years of training, thousands of hours spent learning to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly when violence threatened, to protect himself and others without becoming the aggressor. As he walked toward the gymnasium, Ethan thought about David Kim, the freshman who had been cornered 3 weeks ago. The younger boy had transferred to a different school the following week, his family deciding that Westfield High wasn't the right fit for their son. In trying to protect David, Ethan had only delayed his suffering, forcing him to find safety somewhere else. But running wasn't an option for Ethan. This was the school his mother had sacrificed to get him into, the place where he was supposed to build the foundation for his future. He couldn't transfer to another district, couldn't ask his mother to uproot their lives again because he was unable to handle a group of bullies. The gymnasium doors loomed ahead, their metal surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun like shields. Beyond those doors waited Marcus Thompson and whatever consequences came with standing up to the social order that governed Westfield High. Ethan paused for a moment, his hand on the door handle, and thought about Professor Santos's final lesson from their most recent training session. The mark of a true martial artist is not that he never faces conflict, but that when conflict finds him, he meets it with courage, wisdom, and respect for the humanity of even his opponents. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, ready to discover what kind of person he really was. When everything he'd learned was put to the ultimate test, the gymnasium felt cavernous in the late afternoon silence. The usual chaos of physical education classes had ended hours ago, leaving behind only the lingering scent of disinfectant and the hollow echo of Ethan's footsteps against the polished wooden floor. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting long rectangular shadows that striped the court like prison bars. Marcus Thompson stood at center court, no longer wearing his letterman jacket, but dressed in athletic shorts and a tank top that displayed the results of 4 years of dedicated weight training. His transformation from the polished student politician to something more primal was complete. This wasn't about maintaining social hierarchies anymore. This was personal. Derek had positioned himself near the equipment storage room, his camera already recording from multiple angles using phones mounted on various pieces of gym equipment. The setup was professional, suggesting they'd done this before and planned to do it again. Tyler Walsh stretched against the wall like a prizefighter preparing for a bout, while Kevin Foster stood guard at the main entrance, ensuring their privacy wouldn't be interrupted. "Punctual," Marcus said as Ethan approached. "I respect that." Shows you understand the seriousness of the situation. The space between them felt charged with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. Ethan could feel his heart rate elevating, but his breathing remained controlled. 3 years of training had taught him to recognize the difference between useful adrenaline and panic, to channel the body's fight-or-flight response into focused awareness rather than chaotic fear. "Here's how this works," Marcus continued, beginning to circle Ethan like a shark testing the waters. "You apologize for disrespecting me. You admit you don't belong here. And then we see how well you handle a little physical education." He nodded toward Derek, who produced a pair of scissors from his backpack. They weren't the small safety scissors used in elementary school crafts, but heavy-duty shears designed for cutting through tough materials. The metal gleamed under the gymnasium lights as Derek tested the mechanism, the blades sliding against each other with a sound like whispered threats. "Nice jacket," Marcus observed, reaching out to touch the navy blue fabric. "Expensive for someone from your neighborhood. Bet your mom worked extra shifts to afford something this nice." Ethan jerked away from the contact, but Tyler had moved. Behind him, massive hands settling on his shoulders like iron weights. The linebacker's grip was firm enough to immobilize without causing obvious injury, the kind of restraint that left no visible evidence but communicated absolute control. "Don't be difficult," Tyler rumbled. "This can be easy or hard. Your choice." Derek approached with the scissors, his phone camera capturing every moment. The red recording light blinked steadily, documenting what would become either Ethan's humiliation or evidence of something more serious. But Derek's hands shook slightly as he held the shears, suggesting that even he wasn't entirely comfortable with what they were planning. "Start with the sleeves," Marcus instructed. "Something visible but not completely destructive. We're not animals." The first cut came without warning, the blade slicing through the jacket's left sleeve near the shoulder. The sound was surprisingly loud in the empty gymnasium, like fabric screaming. The severed piece fell to the floor, leaving Ethan's arm partially exposed and the jacket's symmetry destroyed. "This is what happens," Marcus said conversationally, "when people forget their place. When they think they can interfere with the natural order of things." Another cut, this time through the right sleeve. Derek was gaining confidence now, his movements becoming more deliberate. The expensive fabric that Ethan's mother had chosen so carefully was being reduced to scraps, each cut representing hours of her labor at the hospital. "My mom bought this jacket," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "I know," Marcus replied. "That's what makes this educational. Actions have consequences. Your action 3 weeks ago is having consequences. Right now." The cutting continued methodically. Strips of fabric littered the gymnasium floor like confetti from a celebration of cruelty. Derek had found his rhythm now, the scissors moving with practiced efficiency as they destroyed not just clothing, but the dignity it represented. "You know what I find interesting?" Marcus continued his monologue while the destruction proceeded. "You're not fighting back, not even trying to get away. Almost like you're accepting that this is what you deserve." But Ethan wasn't accepting anything. His apparent passivity was something else entirely. The calm before the storm, the stillness that Professor Santos had taught him to cultivate in moments of extreme stress. He was studying their positions, memorizing their movements, waiting for the moment when Tyler's grip would shift enough to give him options. The breaking point came when Derek reached for Ethan's backpack. Inside were his textbooks, his homework, and buried at the bottom, the hand wraps he used for training. But there was something else, a small framed photograph of him and his mother from his 8th grade graduation, the day she'd told him how proud she was of his academic achievements. "Let's see what else we can destroy," Derek said, pulling the photograph from the bag. The frame was simple plastic, but the image it protected was irreplaceable. His mother's smile on one of the few days when financial stress hadn't overshadowed their celebrations. Derek held the photograph up to The camera, narrating like a documentary filmmaker. "Look at this, poor kid and his hardworking mom. This is who thinks he can challenge us." Then he let it fall to the floor and raised his foot to stomp on it. That was the moment everything changed. The photograph represented more than just a memory. It represented every sacrifice his mother had made, every extra shift she'd worked, every time she'd gone without something she needed so that Ethan could have opportunities she'd never had. It represented the love and hope that had driven her to move districts, to find a better school, to believe that education could lift them out of poverty. And Marcus Thompson and his crew thought they could destroy it for entertainment. The rage that flooded through Ethan's system was different from anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't the hot, chaotic anger of a teenage tantrum, but something colder and more focused. It was the righteous fury of someone who had finally seen the true face of the system he'd been trying so hard to navigate peacefully. Tyler's grip on his shoulders was still firm, but the linebacker had made a crucial mistake. He was focused on the photograph, watching Derek's performance for the camera rather than monitoring his prisoner. His weight had shifted slightly forward, his balance compromised by his attention to the spectacle. Ethan moved with explosive precision, using techniques he'd drilled thousands of times, but never needed to employ with serious intent. His left hand came up and grabbed Tyler's right wrist, while his right hand reached across to grip the linebacker's left elbow. In one fluid motion, he dropped his shoulder and pivoted, using Tyler's own forward momentum to throw him in a classic judo technique called seoi nage. Tyler's massive frame sailed through the air and crashed into a stack of gymnastic mats with a sound like thunder. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a whooshing gasp, and he lay there for several seconds, stunned by the sudden reversal of their positions. The gymnasium fell silent except for the sound of Tyler's labored breathing and the soft whir of Derek's camera continuing to record. Marcus stared in disbelief, his confident demeanor cracking for the first time. Kevin took a step backward, suddenly uncertain about the dynamics of the situation. Ethan bent down and carefully picked up the photograph, checking to make sure the glass wasn't cracked. His mother's smile looked back at him, untouched by Derek's intended violence. He slipped it back into his backpack with gentle reverence, then turned to face Marcus with an expression that had transformed completely. "You made a mistake," Ethan said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that filled the large space. "You thought this was about respect, about maintaining your position in some social hierarchy. But this was never about that." He gestured to the destroyed jacket, the scattered fabric that represented so much more than clothing. "This is about cruelty, about taking pleasure in destroying things that matter to people who can't fight back, about using your privilege to hurt others because you can." Marcus tried to regain his composure, but something fundamental had shifted. The boy he'd planned to humiliate was standing straighter, moving with confidence, speaking with the voice of someone who was no longer afraid. "Tyler's fine," Marcus said, though the linebacker was still struggling to regain his footing. "You just got lucky. But there are still 3 of us and 1 of you." "No," Ethan replied, his gaze steady. "There are 3 bullies and 1 person who's tired of watching good people get hurt." The confrontation had reached its tipping point. Marcus realized that his carefully planned demonstration of power had backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking Ethan's spirit, they had awakened something that none of them were prepared to handle. Derek's camera continued recording, but now it was capturing something very different from what they'd intended. Instead of documenting a victim's humiliation, it was about to record the moment when the victim became something else entirely. The real fight was about to begin. The atmosphere in the gymnasium had transformed from predatory confidence to electric uncertainty. Tyler Walsh struggled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. The star linebacker had never been thrown by someone half his size, never found himself on the receiving end of violence he couldn't understand or counter. His breathing was labored, not just from the impact with the mats, but from the psychological shock of discovering that his physical dominance was an illusion. Marcus Thompson stood frozen in the center of the court, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The script he'd written for this encounter had been torn up and scattered like the fabric from Ethan's jacket. Everything about Ethan Parker had changed in the span of 30 seconds. His posture, his voice, his presence. The quiet boy who had spent 3 years avoiding confrontation had revealed himself to be something entirely different. Derek Miller continued filming, but his hands were shaking now. What had started as documentation of a routine humiliation had become something much more serious. The camera captured every detail as the balance of power shifted in real time, transforming his planned trophy video into potential evidence of something none of them had anticipated. Kevin Foster pressed himself against the gymnasium wall, his role as lookout forgotten as he watched the drama unfold. He had signed up to be part of Marcus's inner circle for the social benefits and protection it provided, not for whatever this was becoming. The fear in his eyes was visible, even from across the court. "You think one lucky throw changes anything?" Marcus said, trying to project authority he no longer felt. "You're still outnumbered. You're still going to learn your lesson." But even as he spoke, Marcus was reassessing the situation. Ethan's movement had been too smooth, too controlled to be accidental. The way he'd used Tyler's own momentum against him suggested training. Real training, not the kind of amateur wrestling that most high school students learn from movies and video games. "I need you to understand something," Ethan said, his voice carrying the calm certainty that Professor Santos had taught him to cultivate in high-stress situations. "This doesn't have to continue. You can stop this right now, clean up this mess, and we can all walk away." Tyler roared and charged across the gymnasium floor, his cleats pounding against the wood like a stampede. He was running on pure emotion. Now his tactical thinking overwhelmed by the need to reassert his dominance through brute force. His plan was simple: tackle Ethan to the ground and use his superior size and weight to pin him until Marcus could decide what happened next. But Ethan had been preparing for exactly this scenario for 3 years. As Tyler approached, time seemed to slow down. Every detail became crystal clear: the angle of Tyler's shoulders, the timing of his footsteps, the slight favor he was showing on his left side due to an old football injury that Ethan had observed during countless pay classes. Instead of trying to avoid the charge or meet it head-on, Ethan stepped to his left and slightly forward, a movement so subtle that the cameras barely captured it. As Tyler's massive frame rushed past, Ethan's arms wrapped around the linebacker's neck in a motion that looked almost like a hug. But it wasn't an embrace. It was a rear naked choke, one of the most fundamental and effective techniques in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Tyler's forward momentum carried both of them several feet across the gymnasium floor, but Ethan had locked his grip with technical precision. His right arm encircled Tyler's neck, his right hand gripping his left bicep. His left hand pressed against the back of Tyler's head, completing the choke that would compress the carotid arteries and cut off blood flow to the brain. "Sleep," Ethan whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of 3 years of training and a lifetime of being underestimated. Tyler's struggles became more frantic as he realized he couldn't break free from the hold. His hands clawed at Ethan's arms, but the smaller boy had positioned himself perfectly, using Tyler's own body as protection while maintaining the choke with unbreakable technique. The linebacker tried to throw his weight backward, to slam Ethan against the gymnasium wall, but Ethan simply adjusted his position and maintained control. The sound Tyler made as consciousness began to leave him was somewhere between a growl and a whimper. His massive hands, which had intimidated countless students over the years, fluttered helplessly against Ethan's forearms. His legs, powerful enough to drive through opposing defensive lines, began to buckle as his brain was systematically deprived of oxygen. "Let him go!" Marcus shouted, but his voice carried desperation rather than authority. He had never seen Tyler Walsh look vulnerable, had never imagined that someone could simply turn off the linebacker's consciousness like flipping a switch. Ethan maintained the choke for exactly as long as necessary, until Tyler's body went limp and his struggles ceased completely. Then he lowered the unconscious linebacker to the floor with careful control, ensuring that Tyler wouldn't be injured. By the fall, the entire sequence had taken less than 20 seconds, but it felt like hours to everyone watching. Derek's camera captured everything with unwavering focus, though his breathing was now audible on the recording. "Oh my God," he whispered, the words automatically picked up by the phone's microphone. "Oh my God, he just choked him out." Marcus stared at Tyler's motionless form, then at Ethan, who was checking to make sure the linebacker was breathing normally. The technical precision of what he'd just witnessed was undeniable. This wasn't luck or accident, but the application of genuine skill against someone who outweighed him by at least 60 pounds. "Where did you learn to do that?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Gracie Academy," Ethan replied simply, standing up and brushing dust from his torn clothing. 3 years, 4 days a week. Professor Santos doesn't just teach techniques. He teaches control, respect, and the responsibility that comes with knowledge. The name meant nothing to Marcus, but Derek had grown pale. His older brother had trained at a different Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school across town before joining the military, and Derek had heard enough stories to understand what he was witnessing. "You've been training this whole time?" Derek asked, his camera still recording, but his voice filled with new respect and fear. "All those times we saw you in the hallways, eating lunch alone, being quiet, you were learning how to do this?" "I was learning how to protect myself and others," Ethan corrected. "The goal was never to hurt anyone. But when you target innocent people, when you destroy things that matter to them just because you can, someone has to draw a line." Marcus looked around the gymnasium, taking inventory of his remaining resources. Tyler was unconscious on the floor, breathing but unresponsive. Kevin was pressed against the wall, clearly unwilling to engage. Derek was still filming but had made no move to help. For the first time in his high school career, Marcus Thompson was truly alone. "This is insane," Marcus said, though he seemed to be talking to himself as much as to Ethan. "You're going to get expelled, arrested. You just assaulted a student on school property." Ethan gestured toward Derek's camera, which had been recording everything from multiple angles. "The video shows Tyler charging at me after your group destroyed my property and threatened to destroy something with sentimental value. It shows me defending myself using appropriate force and immediately checking on his welfare afterward." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Not only had his demonstration of power failed spectacularly, but every moment had been documented by his own crew. The evidence that would have supported their version of events, Ethan as the aggressor, their actions as justified response, had been replaced by a clear record of who the real aggressors were. "Besides," Ethan continued, kneeling down to gather the pieces of his destroyed jacket, "I'm not the one who brought weapons to school." He nodded toward the scissors that Derek had dropped during the chaos, their metal blades gleaming under the tail. Gymnasium lights. The implications were clear. What they had planned wasn't just bullying, but destruction of property with a weapon, potentially classifiable as assault with a deadly weapon if a prosecutor wanted to pursue it aggressively. Derek powered down his camera and slipped it into his backpack, suddenly understanding that continuing to record might not serve his interests. "Maybe we should all just forget this happened," he suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think that's possible," came a new voice from the gymnasium entrance. Everyone turned to see Mrs. Rodriguez standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression grim. Behind her stood Principal Chen and Officer James Martinez, the school's resource officer, whose hand rested casually on his radio. The custodial staff reported sounds of a disturbance, Principal Chun said, voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with countless teenage crises. They were concerned about students being in the building unsupervised after hours. Officer Martinez surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had investigated numerous incidents involving teenagers and poor decision-making. Tyler was beginning to stir, his eyes fluttering as consciousness slowly returned. The scattered fabric from Ethan's jacket told part of the story, while the scissors on the floor filled in additional details. "Son," Officer Martinez addressed Ethan, "are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," Ethan replied, though his torn clothing and the stress of the confrontation were clearly visible. Tyler might need to be checked for concussion, though. He hit the mats pretty hard. The officer knelt beside Tyler, who was now sitting up but still looking confused and disoriented. "Can you tell me your name and what day it is?" Martinez asked, beginning a basic assessment for head injury. Tyler's answers were slow but accurate, suggesting that while he had been unconscious, there was no serious neurological damage. The relief on everyone's faces was visible, even Marcus's, though he was clearly calculating how to minimize his legal exposure. "Everybody stays right here," Principal Chin announced. "Officer Martinez, I think we need to call some parents and have some very serious conversations about what happened here today." As the adults took control of the situation, Ethan found himself surrounded by the aftermath of a confrontation he had tried for years to avoid. His training had prepared him for the physical aspects of self-defense, but nothing could have prepared him for the emotional complexity of actually using those skills against classmates. Tyler was going to be fine, which brought tremendous relief. But the video Derek had recorded would spread beyond Westfield High, carrying Ethan's story to audiences he never wanted to reach. The quiet invisibility he had cultivated so carefully was gone forever, replaced by a notoriety that would follow him for the rest of his time at school. As paramedics arrived to evaluate, Tyler and police officers began documenting the scene. Ethan thought about his mother, who would soon receive a phone call that would terrify her. He thought about Professor Santos, who had taught him that true strength meant protecting others, not dominating them. And he thought about David Kim, the freshman who had transferred schools rather than face continued harassment. The system that had allowed Marcus and his crew to operate with impunity was about to face serious scrutiny. The video evidence would force administrators to confront behaviors they had previously chosen to ignore. The investigation would reveal patterns of intimidation and harassment that had been dismissed as typical teenage social dynamics. But for Ethan, the most important result was simpler than any institutional change. He had drawn a line that needed to be drawn. He had protected something that mattered. And he had proven to himself as much as to anyone else that quiet people weren't necessarily weak people. They were often just people waiting for the right moment to show their strength. The gymnasium that had witnessed so much cruelty over the years had finally seen something different. Not revenge or domination, but the kind of courage that stood up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. It wasn't the end of bullying at Westfield High, but it was the beginning of something better, the recognition that actions have consequences, and that sometimes the quietest people have the loudest voices when they finally choose to speak. As the official investigation began, Officer Martinez separated the students for individual interviews. Each would tell their version of events, but the video evidence would provide the objective truth that no amount of spin could alter. Derek's camera had captured not just the physical confrontation, but the systematic destruction of property, the threatening behavior, and the clear escalation that had led to Ethan's defensive actions. "I want to understand something, officer," Martinez said to Ethan as they sat in the empty bleachers while paramedics finished evaluating Tyler. "You had 3 years of martial arts training. You could have seriously injured these boys if you'd wanted to. Why didn't you?" The question struck at the heart of everything Professor Santos had taught him. "Because the goal was never to hurt anyone," Ethan explained. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu teaches you that violence should be the last resort, and when you do use it, you use only what's necessary to stop the threat. Tyler wasn't trying to seriously hurt me. He was trying to humiliate me, so I stopped him without causing permanent damage. Officer Martinez nodded slowly, making notes in his report. That kind of restraint is unusual in teenagers. Most kids, in a fight situation, just react emotionally. That's exactly what Professor Santos warned against, Ethan replied. He always said that the moment you let emotion control your actions, you stop being a martial artist and become just another person, causing harm. Principal Chun approached, her expression a mixture of concern and administrative calculation. The incident would require careful handling to avoid negative publicity for the school, but she also recognized that this was an opportunity to address problems that had been festering beneath the surface for too long. Ethan, she said, settling onto the bleacher beside him, I need you to know that we take this situation very seriously. But I also need to understand how we missed the signs that things had escalated to this point. The conversation that followed would be difficult for Principal Chun to hear. Ethan described the systematic intimidation that had been building for weeks, the way Marcus and his crew had used their social position to operate outside normal disciplinary channels, and the atmosphere of fear that prevented other students from reporting harassment. David Kim transferred schools because of these same students, Ethan explained. I tried to help him, and that's what made me a target. But how many other students have just suffered in silence, rather than risk making things worse? Mrs. Rodriguez, who had witnessed the tail end of the earlier hallway confrontation, added her own observations. I've seen concerning interactions between these students before, but they were always careful to avoid doing anything actionable when adults were present. They've been operating in the blind spots of our supervision. The implications were sobering. Westfield High's reputation for academic excellence had been built partly on maintaining the appearance of a well-ordered environment. But that order had been maintained through a system that allowed certain students to police others through intimidation and fear. As word of the incident spread through the school's social networks, the reactions varied dramatically. Some students expressed shock that quiet Ethan Parker had been capable of such decisive action. Others admitted they had witnessed Marcus's group engaging in similar behavior, but had been too frightened to report it. A few came forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation that had previously gone unreported. Derek Miller found himself in the most complicated position of all. His video evidence was crucial to understanding what had happened, but it also documented his own participation in the destruction of Ethan's property. During his interview with school officials, he broke down completely, admitting that the harassment had been escalating for weeks, and that they had specifically chosen the gymnasium because they knew it wasn't monitored by security cameras. Marcus said we needed to make an example, Derek confessed, tears streaming down his face. He said if word got out that anyone could interfere with us without consequences, then we'd lose respect. But I never thought it would go this far. I never thought someone could just turn Tyler off like that. Kevin Foster's interview revealed the extent to which fear had motivated his participation. He admitted that he had never wanted to be part of the harassment but had been too terrified of becoming a target himself to refuse Marcus's demands. You don't understand, Kevin explained to Officer Martinez. Marcus has connections. His dad knows people on the school board, donates money to the athletic programs. If you cross him, you don't just deal with him, you deal with everyone who wants to stay on his good side. The revelation highlighted one of the most troubling aspects of the situation. The way wealth and social connections had created a system where certain students operated under different rules than others. Marcus Thompson hadn't just been a high school bully. He had been enabled by adults who valued his family's contributions more than the safety of other students. Tyler Walsh's interview was perhaps the most revealing of all. As the effects of the chokehold wore off and his thinking cleared, he began to process what had actually happened to him. For the first time in his life, he had encountered someone who couldn't be intimidated by his size and strength, someone who possessed skills that made his physical advantages irrelevant. "I've never felt helpless like that," he admitted to the school counselor who was evaluating his psychological state. "I couldn't get away from him. I couldn't break his hold. I couldn't breathe. And then everything just went black." The experience had shattered Tyler's worldview in ways that would take months to fully process. He had built his identity around physical dominance, using his size to intimidate others and maintain his position in the school's social hierarchy. Discovering that someone half his size could render him unconscious in seconds forced him to confront the possibility that his entire approach to social interaction had been fundamentally flawed. Marcus Thompson's interview was the most combative. Even faced with video evidence of his role in orchestrating the harassment, he maintained that Ethan had overreacted to what was meant to be a harmless prank. His inability to accept responsibility for the escalation revealed the depth of his entitlement and the degree to which he had been insulated from consequences throughout his academic career. "This is insane," Marcus insisted during his interview with Principal Chun. "He used some kind of martial arts move on Tyler. That's assault. That's a serious crime. And you're treating him like he's the victim?" Principal Chun had been prepared for this response. "Marcus, we have video evidence showing you and your friend systematically destroying another student's property while he was physically restrained. We have documentation of weeks of harassment and intimidation." Ethan's actions were clearly defensive in nature. The legal implications were becoming clear as well. Officer Martinez had already been in contact with the district attorney's office, and while criminal charges were unlikely given the circumstances, the school was facing potential civil liability for failing to protect students from harassment. The Parker family would have grounds for a significant lawsuit, the school's legal counsel explained during an emergency meeting of the administrative team. "We have documented evidence that harassment was occurring, and we failed to take adequate steps to prevent it from escalating." The conversation that evening between Ethan and his mother was one of the most difficult of his life. Linda Parker had rushed to the school after receiving the call about the incident, arriving to find her son physically unharmed, but emotionally exhausted from the day's events. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself," she said as they sat in their small kitchen, the destroyed remains of his jacket spread across the table like evidence from a crime scene. "But I'm also terrified about what this means for your future." The video of the incident was already spreading across social media platforms, edited and re-edited by students who hadn't witnessed the events firsthand. Some versions portrayed Ethan as a hero standing up to bullies. Others focused on the dramatic moment when Tyler collapsed, turning it into entertainment rather than documentation of a serious confrontation. "This is going to follow you for the rest of high school," Linda said, studying the fabric that had been so carefully cut to pieces. "Colleges might see these videos. Future employers might find them online. Are you prepared for that kind of attention?" It was a question that Ethan had been avoiding since the moment the adults had arrived at the gymnasium. His carefully maintained invisibility was gone forever, replaced by a notoriety that he had never wanted. The quiet boy who had spent 3 years avoiding attention was now the subject of countless conversations, social media posts, and speculation about his background and training. "You did well," the professor said finally. "You used appropriate force, you protected yourself and others, and you showed restraint when you could have caused serious harm. But now comes the harder test." Ethan looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "Now you must deal with the consequences of being known as someone who can defend himself," Professor Santos explained. "Some people will respect you. Others will see you as a threat to be eliminated. Still others will challenge you to prove that what happened today wasn't luck." The wisdom in those words would prove prophetic in the weeks and months that followed. Ethan's action had disrupted the social order at Westfield High in ways that would create ripple effects throughout the student body. Some students would find courage to report harassment they had previously endured in silence. Others would seek him out for protection or training. And a few would view his newfound reputation as a challenge to be met with escalating force. But for now, sitting in his family's small kitchen with his mother and his teacher, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the certainty that he had done the right thing, regardless of the consequences. The quiet boy had found his voice, and the sound it made would echo through the halls of Westfield High long after the bruises had healed and the videos had been forgotten. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.